The senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I have 5 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, Americans are paying more and getting less for just about everything. More for energy, more for housing, more for the most basic necessities. And frankly, they're tired of it. Across the country, businesses are struggling with higher costs, families are burdened by rising prices, and entire industries are stalling under the weight of heavy-handed regulations handed down from unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. The Department of the Interior could and should be part of the problem. Instead, it could and should be part of the solution. Instead, it's been part of the problem. In fact, in many instances, in countless respects, it is the problem. The worst part, it didn't have to be this way. Under Secretary Deb Haaland, the Biden administration had a choice. They had the tools at their disposal to alleviate the struggles of millions of Americans and ensure affordable, reliable energy. Instead, it chose to abandon them. Instead, it chose to surrender to ideological zealotry and foreign powers who do not have our best interests at heart. Now, Americans are paying the price. Mr. President, the Department of the Interior is not an agency of limited consequence. It governs nearly 1/5 of the landmass of the entire United States. It wields the power to dictate the fate of energy production, water rights, wildlife conservation, and the livelihoods of millions of Americans, especially in public land-rich states like my home state of Utah. And yet for the last 4 years, Secretary Haaland stood idly by, doubling down on policies that throttled domestic production while begging foreign adversaries to fill the gap. Governor Doug Burgum understands what Secretary Haaland apparently forgot. Abundant, affordable energy is a fundamental pillar of our national security as Americans. But Secretary Haaland's failures don't stop at energy. The Department of the Interior touches nearly every aspect of life in the West, from land management to water rights, often to the detriment of those who depend on them. Now, for states like Utah, where 2/3 of the land is owned by the federal government, Washington's mismanagement is not an abstract or a theoretical debate. The consequences that we face as a result of decisions made at Interior affect us in a real and profound way. Expanding national monuments without local input and contrary to what local input was given, imposing suffocating land use restrictions, and burying, quite deliberately, resource development under an avalanche of red tape are not the actions of a government that serves them. They are the actions of a government that rules and lords over them. The consequences of that mismanagement stretch higher than elevated prices at the pump. As wildfires ravage the West, reducing homes to ash and livelihoods to memory, Secretary Haaland and President Biden condescendingly lectured the American people that climate change is to blame. Unfortunately for them, the reality is far less convenient. Decades of federal neglect have transformed our forests into kindling. Their refusal to engage in responsible forest management, to clear the deadwood, to thin the overgrowth, has created a veritable tinderbox of catastrophic proportions. And still, they offered nothing but platitudes and punitive regulations that all but ensured that the cycle of destruction would continue. The West faces another government-made crisis: housing. Entire generations are locked out of home ownership as federal mismanagement hoards vast swaths of land that could be used to alleviate the crisis. The Department of the Interior could be an instrument of relief, identifying underutilized federal lands and unlocking them for development. My bill, the Houses Act, shows how we can do this. But for the past 4 years, the government has lamented housing shortages while ensuring their permanence. It's drawn near to the plight of the American people with its lips, but its heart has been shown to be far from those they're supposed to serve. And then, of course, there's water. The Colorado River, a lifeline of the West, is withering, strangled by indecision and regulatory paralysis. States plead for coordination to create a coherent strategy to preserve this resource for millions. What they receive instead are ditherings from an administration more interested in virtue signaling than problem solving. DOI desperately needs a leader who will act. Governor Burgum is that leader. We need a leader who grasps that our national parks, America's crown jewels, have great potential to be economic engines, drawing millions and sustaining, in some cases, entire communities. Yet infrastructure crumbles, visitor access is restricted, and the federal government's response is as lethargic as it is incompetent. Governor Burgum understands what's at stake. He spent his entire career bringing people together to solve problems. He's earned the trust of tribes, of businesses, conservationists, and working families alike. He understands that we cannot regulate our way into prosperity, nor can we regulate our way into abundance. He understands that it's not just numbers on a balance sheet or reports gathering dust in Washington. It is real. And for many of us, it's deeply, deeply personal. A rancher in Utah is watching his grazing rights disappear under arbitrary federal decrees. A miner in West Virginia sees his livelihood strangled by regulations written by people who have never even set foot in a coal town. A small business owner in Arizona is struggling with soaring energy costs that make it harder to keep the lights on. A farmer in Wyoming is fighting for water that once flowed freely, but is now trapped. These are the people who suffer when the Department of the Interior forgets its mission. These are the families who pay the price when Washington prioritizes leftist ideology over reality. Governor Doug Burgum's leadership offers a clear alternative, a future where the Department of the Interior serves the people rather than ruling over them, a future where energy abundance strengthens our economy and our national security, a future where public lands are managed with the input of those who depend on them, not dictated by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats far off in Washington, D.C. A future where housing is within reach, water is safeguarded, and natural resources are used responsibly to support the communities that rely on them. A future where Americans can depend on more than just serendipity. They can rely on sound policies designed to benefit them. Americans can and should be getting more for their dollar. Governor Burgum understands that and has the experience and vision to make it happen. It's time, Mr. President, for us to confirm Governor Doug Burgum as the next Secretary of the Interior. It's time for us to move forward. It's time to accept that freedom is the destiny and birthright of the American people. The government exists to serve us, not the other way around. I urge my colleagues with all the urgency I'm capable of communicating to swiftly and resoundingly confirm Governor Doug Burgum. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I have 9 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, the American people are being told, once again, not to trust their own eyes. Democrats are telling them not to worry about their soaring electricity bills. They're telling them to ignore rolling blackouts. Republicans are just fear-mongering, they say. But of course, the reality is that Americans have seen the power shortages. They've paid the higher bills. They've felt the weight of the past 4 years of the failed policies of the Biden administration. And we cannot ignore the resulting crisis anymore. The power grid is buckling. Energy demand is exploding. And the very people who created this mess are now telling us, quite audaciously, that there is no emergency. Why? Well, they claim that the United States is producing more energy than we have in American history. But what they conveniently omit is that we're consuming more energy than at any time in American history, and we're expected to need much, much more within just the next few years. Much more than we're producing, much more than we ever have produced. So it's not enough to just look at how much we're producing relative to what we have produced in the past when you don't take into account the demand, what we need, and what we need is going way, way up. Now, according to Goldman Sachs, artificial intelligence alone, just artificial intelligence, nothing else, not population growth, not any other uses, household or industrial, of energy. Just artificial intelligence alone is likely to drive a 160% increase in data center power demand by 2030. The largest data centers can consume more power than 700,000 households. That's equivalent to the energy use of a city of 1.8 million people. But there's no emergency, according to them. According to the sponsors of this resolution, this is just a handout. It's a handout to big oil, as they characterize it. Now, good luck with that. Try telling that to the American families and businesses that struggled during the January 2025 polar vortex when the U.S. power grid was pushed to its absolute limits. Electricity demand hit historic highs, forcing grid operators to rely heavily on coal and natural gas, the very sources of power that Democrats want to eliminate and have been working aggressively with some effectiveness to do precisely that, to eliminate, just to keep the lights on. It's not big oil that will suffer in the winters if we fail to keep the power on. Across multiple power market regions, electricity demand during that event set new single-day records as heating demand across sectors spiked. In response, grid operators had to rely heavily on dispatchable generation, primarily coal and natural gas, to ensure system reliability and stabilize supply during the extreme event. Now, during that time, coal-fired power plants dramatically increased their electric power output. That is, those coal-fired power plants that have not yet been torn down at the demand of Democratic-backed policies. In many regions, coal capacity factors soared above 80%, far exceeding typical winter levels. On the other hand, wind and solar were challenged by unfavorable weather conditions. On peak days, wind and solar generated only 3% and 0.2% of the incremental electricity needed to meet demand. But what exactly are Democrats worried about? What's their concern amidst that very emergency, which if that's not an emergency, I don't know what is. So what is it that they're worried about? Well, not grid failures, not surging energy costs, not the reliability of our power supply. No, they're concerned that President Trump is making things worse by canceling the wind and solar projects that failed to generate enough power to meet demand at those peak moments when it was so badly needed. They're using the same old playbook that they always have. Do anything to prevent President Trump from getting a win, regardless of whether his policies might actually bring relief to the American people, which, of course, they would. Mr. President, I've spent my career fighting against unchecked executive power. I authored the Article 1 Act to curb the abuse of presidential emergency declarations, requiring congressional approval within 30 days. But let me be clear, this is not an abuse of those powers. Not by a mile, not at all, not in any way, shape, or form. It is a real emergency. And if President Trump's declaration were put to a vote today, this chamber would affirm it. Congress has had countless chances to fix this problem and failed every time. Republicans have fought for years to reform our outdated permitting laws, only to be met with Democratic resistance at every turn. NEPA, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, Democrats treat these laws as if they were sacred texts, untouchable even when they're clearly broken. A sacred text that can't be not just repealed, but even amended meaningfully to avert the disaster that they've created, especially created in the hands of the previous administration. Now, at this moment, we hear that they're ready to play ball. Now and only now do they say, oh, yeah, we need to deal with this. Now, if that's true, great. But let's see. If Democrats are serious about fixing it, now is the time to prove it. Until Congress acts, how can anyone really blame the president for stepping in to address this emergency, which it is, which it has become, which it undeniably is? In some cases, an emergency can be created by the government itself, or at least severely exacerbated. And that is the case here. His executive order tells agencies to do exactly what Congress has neglected to do for years. Exactly what Congress has been unable to do, in large part because Democrats have resisted that, getting back to the sacred text theory of these same laws that have become part of the problem. However, rather than working with President Trump and Republicans in a productive way to try to make energy more accessible for Americans and more reliable, and of course, remain affordable, Senate Democrats are forcing a vote on a resolution to terminate President Trump's declaration and reinstate the restrictive energy policies from the Biden administration's Green New Deal. Look, Mr. President, at where those policies have left us, where they've put us, where we are, and where we're headed. Energy prices increased by 30.54%. Gasoline prices increased by 30.5%. Electricity prices increased by 28.55%, and natural gas prices increased by 33.3%. Meanwhile, Democrats' message to American families is clear. Pay more, expect less. It's this sort of gospel of scarcity. The idea that we have to live off of scarcity because that's what they demand, because government wants it that way for reasons that only they can fully articulate, but that the American people do not find persuasive. This is a problem. The United States is, in fact, in an energy emergency. Not because of a lack of resources, but because the Biden administration's unrelenting regulatory assault on domestic oil and gas production in blind adherence to the climate cartel has put us in this position. Now, President Biden's executive orders, including his orders that he issued on his very first day as President of the United States back in January of 2021, pausing all new oil and gas leasing on federal lands, where nearly 25% of U.S. oil production occurs, significantly hindered U.S. energy independence. Even after courts mandated the resumption of these leasing programs, essential to our energy development, Secretary Haaland slow-walked the process, offering the fewest acres for lease since World War II and holding a record low number of offshore lease sales. The chilling effect of the Biden administration's anti-production policies is as undeniable as it is indefensible as a matter of public policy. Oil companies are withdrawing from investments in federal lands due to the uncertainty created by erratic leasing decisions and hostile regulatory policies. Now, let's remember, of course, Mr. President, that this is made more severe by virtue of the fact that the United States government is not just the largest landowner in the United States, but it owns around 28%, between 1/4 quarter and 1/3 of all land in the United States. We compound that by giving enormous discretion to federal land management agencies, to the executive branch. Then you put in place an administration that wants to preach and live by the gospel of scarcity, and that's a recipe for disaster. Biden's EPA contributed meaningfully to the problem as well. The Biden EPA introduced methane fees starting at $900 per metric ton in 2025, increasing to $1,500 over just a fairly short period of time. That imposes significant financial burdens on producers, particularly small operators. Now, lest anyone led by the Democratic talking points might be tempted to look at this and say, oh, but they're businesses. They can afford it. Suck it up. Just deal with it. That's not really who pays for this, Mr. President. No, these things get passed on. The wealthy folks, at least the wealthy folks who own these businesses, they're not the ones hardest hit by this. Those hardest hit are American families, particularly in sort of the low and middle income brackets. Those who, like so many Americans, live paycheck to paycheck. It's those people whose way of life, whose livelihood, whose ability to afford life is so dramatically affected by these regulatory intrusions into the marketplace. Those are the people who get hurt, and that really is a problem. Meanwhile, as our domestic production slows, our reliance on foreign oil increases. In 2023, we imported 1.3 million barrels per day from OPEC, up nearly 50% from 2020 levels. Meanwhile, critical mineral dependencies on foreign nations, particularly China, threaten everything from titanium in pacemakers and cobalt in batteries to copper in transmission lines and antimony in semiconductors. The absence of just one of these minerals would devastate the sectors they serve. And yet the Biden administration, with its vast discretion, as it invented and reinvented federal regulations, and as it presided over this Byzantine labyrinth of federal regulations, laws put in place by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, can make those things much worse. And it did make those things much worse. And the American people, hardworking Americans, are paying too high a price. Mr. President, the American people are done. They're done with Joe Biden's failed policies. Over 77 million Americans voted for President Trump just a few months ago. And a recent poll shows 60% of Americans support expanding American oil and gas production. Senate Republicans will not let Democrats delay and obstruct any longer. They've created and exacerbated an emergency. President Trump is addressing it as the law allows him to do. We will ensure the President has the tools necessary to deliver the results that the American people justifiably expect, demanded, and truly do deserve. Because the facts are undeniable. America is in an energy emergency because of the federal government, and specifically because of the previous administration's failed policies. Instead of embracing abundant, affordable, and reliable energy, Democrats, again preaching and living by the gospel of scarcity, in which they're so closely wedded, are doubling down on a radical agenda that's made everything from gasoline to electricity more expensive for working families. And remember, when the prices of those energy inputs goes up, so too does the price of everything else, because it becomes more expensive to make, to process, to buy, to sell, to transport, all of those same things. Instead of learning from those failures, Senate Democrats are trying to block President Trump from taking action to fix it. What, are they too afraid that their own policies will be exposed as the source of a significant amount of the problem? Well, You have to ask them about that, but one could certainly make that argument, and it certainly appears to many that this is the case. They're standing in the way of relief for American families, hoping that if they delay long enough, the American people will simply accept high costs as the new normal. Only in Washington could you light the house on fire and then act shocked when someone else tries to put it out. Make no mistake, Mr. President, that is exactly what's happening here. We refuse to let that happen. We applaud President Trump for taking action to address an emergency created by our own government, presided over, directed, embraced, and now defended by the Democratic Party. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Happy anniversary. Happy anniversary. 32 years ago today, President Clinton signed the National Voter Registration Act into law. The so-called Motor Voter Act, that's what it became known as, made common sense, yet unprecedented strides to registering more eligible Americans to vote. Imagine that, taking advantage of the fact that motor vehicle agencies and other state and local government offices that interact with Americans every single day can easily, efficiently, securely assist U.S. citizens with one of those most fundamental rights, registering to vote and participating in our elections. A little over 3 years after it was signed into law, on May 24th, 1996 more precisely, I proudly completed my own training as a deputy registrar in Los Angeles County, which qualified me to register voters in my own community. Now, nearly 2 decades later, I was sworn in as California's 30th Secretary of State, becoming the Chief Elections Officer to the most populous and most diverse state in the nation. And just earlier this year, I was proud to become the ranking member of the Senate Rules and Administrations Committee with jurisdiction over federal elections. So it would be an understatement for me to say that I'm proud to bring my decades of election administration experience to the discussions and deliberations of this body. Now, throughout my time in public service, I've seen personally that one of the single greatest ways to increase not just civic engagement more broadly, but voter registration and voter participation more specifically, is to meet Americans where they already are. And Motor Voter sought to do exactly that, registering voters at state departments of motor vehicles and other public agencies, including state colleges and universities, military recruitment offices, and others. That's a good thing for our democracy, because we should all believe in that most basic of lessons that I believe we all learned in high school civics class, that our democracy works best when as many eligible people participate. Now, one other place that the National Voter Registration Act can and should extend to is naturalization ceremonies, giving new eligible United States citizens the information they need to register to vote should they want to. Now, if you've never had the opportunity to attend one before, I can tell you personally there are few experiences that give you more of that patriotic feeling than inside the four walls of a naturalization ceremony. If you've ever had doubts or questions about what it means to be an American, I encourage you to talk to and ask a newly naturalized citizen. Now, when I served as California Secretary of State, it was such an honor to speak at a number of these ceremonies, and part of the sacredness of the experience that I felt was standing up on the stage, looking out at the audience, and being told by the USCIS personnel how many countries were represented there. Maybe it was dozens of people, maybe it was hundreds of people representing literally dozens or hundreds of countries. So walking into the auditorium, walking into the convention center hall, they were immigrants from countries all over the world. But upon taking that oath and leaving that ceremony, they were all United States citizens. And while some people get to that point of naturalization having been in the country for a couple of years, some after several decades, some coming from working class families, others from very wealthy families, some families that have been here just a few years, others that have been here maybe multiple generations. Maybe some of these new citizens never had a chance to go to college or even high school. Others were there with not just bachelor's and master's degrees, but PhDs, maybe multiple degrees. The one thing that was constant for everybody is that as a United States citizen, you now had the right to vote. And in our elections, not only does every vote count, every vote counts equally. Think about that. How beautiful is that? Now, as I think about the people who go through the process, I can't help but also think about my parents, because they went through the naturalization process. And when I see the dozens or hundreds of immigrants becoming citizens, I envision what their preparation was like, because it was very similar, no doubt, to what my parents did. Taking classes, studying, showing up at every important appointment, filling out all those forms. And on the day they finally take the oath of allegiance, they earn the full benefits of United States citizenship. And so it was an honor and a privilege to be able to address those audiences as Secretary of State and encourage them not just to get involved in community, but to register to vote and exercise their new right to vote. And of course, I would do it on a nonpartisan basis. But the statistics tell us that registration amongst naturalized citizens still lags behind other voters. During the 2022 election, only 61% of naturalized citizens were registered to vote compared to 70% of native-born Americans. So the data tells us that we have a responsibility to do more here. And so that is why today I'm asking my colleagues to pass the Include New Voters in the Electorate Act, also known as the Invite Act. My bill would use the powers of the National Voter Registration Act to designate USCIS field offices as voter registration agencies, effectively giving our field staff not just the opportunity, but the duty to help new eligible United States citizens register to vote. Rather than just hand out a form, it would empower USCIS personnel to actually assist new citizens in completing and returning their voter registration forms. Now, I can predict what some of the counter-argument might be, so let me just say to everyone who regularly expresses concern about non-citizens voting, I would suggest, what better place to make sure citizens are registered than at a naturalization ceremony? With the flexibility to work with state and local agencies however they see fit, my bill would take those spaces that are so crucial to our democracy and turn them into catalysts for democratic participation. Because the responsibilities that come with citizenship don't end upon taking the oath of citizenship. That's just the beginning. So I urge all of my colleagues, Republican and Democrat, to join me in supporting this common sense bill to invest in and strengthen our democracy. So notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of my bill, which is at the desk. I further ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
An objection.
Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, reserving the right to object, I want to thank my friend and colleague, the senior senator from the state of California, for his passion in pursuing what is itself a laudable goal, which is helping newly sworn in, newly naturalized U.S. citizens register to vote. But I've got no choice but to object to this unanimous consent request, this effort to pass it without further debate, without any debate today. I want to point out that this is a bill that hasn't gone through any of the regular processes, and it's therefore inappropriate for us to consider it at this point. Look, the bill itself was just barely introduced. It hasn't had a hearing, hasn't had a markup before the Senate Judiciary Committee, on which we both serve, or otherwise, nor has there been any debate on this topic. Now, no doubt, it's important to make sure that our newly naturalized citizens have the opportunity to register to vote, but that puts the cart before the horse in many regards. If we haven't done our homework, we could cause problems. Now, no one disputes the fact, at least no one disputes the fact now, that there are, in fact, non-citizens voting in federal elections. And no one disputes that there are already laws on the books making it a crime for non-citizens to vote in U.S. elections. U.S. federal elections are for U.S. citizens and no one else, and it's a crime to do otherwise. Now, we've had some of these discussions over the last year, and in the months leading up to the 2024 general election, there were a lot of unsubstantiated claims made to the effect that non-citizens don't vote. We know now that that is not true. There are a number of documented instances from this last general election alone in which that happened. And this reflects the fact that we often do a poor job of making sure that non-citizens don't vote. On the current voter registration form, the federal voter registration form, there's just a box, a little box that one checks for the applicant to indicate whether he or she is a U.S. citizen. Provided that he or she checks that box and later signs the form for a driver's license, that person can then obtain voter registration in the same state in which he or she has applied for a driver's license. And all we have to go on is that person's word as to citizenship. No one asks for documentary proof of citizenship. Now, one might ask, why? Why does no one ask for this, especially if it's a known problem? Well, this dates back to an interpretation of the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA, also sometimes referred to as the Motor Voter Law. There was a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court that interpreted provisions of the NVRA as prohibiting the state officials administering that form, receiving that form, from asking for any kind of proof of citizenship. Now, that interpretation was, in my view, wrong. I agree with Justice Alito's dissent in that case, saying that the statute contains no such requirement. There's nothing in there prohibiting states from doing that. Nonetheless, that ruling stands, remains on the books today, prohibiting state officials, when receiving those forms, from doing any verification, requesting any proof as to citizenship. And that's why I last year introduced a bill called the SAVE Act that would amend the National Voter Registration Act to make clear what I believe was already clear, but that the Supreme Court got wrong, allowing state officials to request proof of citizenship at the time these documents are submitted, and setting requirements for that to happen. Now, the SAVE Act identifies and establishes and outlines acceptable documentation for proving citizenship, and it requires the states to set up alternative verification processes for citizens who don't have the normal, necessary, contemplated documentation, including for those instances, very, very common instances, in which a woman marries and thereafter changes her name to a married name, not evident on any birth certificate she may have. Now, when you contemplate the many dozens of women who support the SAVE Act in this chamber and in the other, and who voted for it in the other chamber, who were part of the process of drafting this bill, they and I and the others who were involved in its drafting, we all went out of our way to make sure that these documentation standards were not unduly onerous. In fact, if anything, they are less onerous than those requirements, those documentation standards that already exist in other areas of the law. Take, for example, labor and employment. Anytime any American citizen starts a new job as an employee, he or she is required to fill out a form called the I-9. The I-9 form requires an American citizen to provide proof of citizenship. And if you're not an American citizen, then you have to provide proof of your work eligibility, providing proof of your visa and the documentation that goes along with that. Now, just as it is true that married women who have changed their name to their married name, a married last name that is different than that found on their birth certificate, just as women every single day across this country are able to start a new job without that being an impediment, we made sure that the SAVE Act would leave things the same way. If anything, we made it easier in the context of casting this sacred, important vote and registering to become eligible to cast such a vote. The legislation, the SAVE Act, also compels states to purge non-citizens from voter rolls and establishes federal penalties for intentionally registering non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Over the last 4 years, many millions upon millions of illegal aliens have entered our country's borders. And of those, a non-zero but ultimately unknown number of them were improperly registered to vote. No one disputes that this is happening. They don't now, they did last summer, they don't now, because the proof is there, and it remains undisputed. At a time when trust in voting is as important as it's ever been, if not more so, we must stop any avenue for foreign election interference, and we need to pass the SAVE Act. Now, voting is both a sacred right and an important responsibility that accompanies American citizenship. And allowing the people of other countries who are not citizens of our country to violate the law and to access our elections and vote in our elections, contrary to law, is a grave blow to our security and our self-governance. The House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed the SAVE Act a few weeks ago, and now it's our turn to pass the SAVE Act, and that we must do. In light of the foregoing, Madam President, and in light of the fact that if we were to take a step like that, contemplated and proposed by my friend and colleague, and he is both the senior senator from California, without putting in place these additional safeguards that we need in the SAVE Act, safeguards that are no more intrusive than, and in fact, if anything, are less intrusive than, those already in existence in everyday events like starting a new job, I must object, and I hereby do object.
The objection is heard.
Madam President, thank you. I think I tried to make the point clear while I respect where my colleague from the state of Utah is coming from. I just fundamentally disagree. The National Voter Registration Act, which this body passed on a bipartisan basis back in 1993, was designed to expand voter registration opportunities by making it easier for eligible Americans to register when they interact with government agencies. Plain and simple. And that's all this bill seeks to do by designating USCIS as a voter registration entity under the NVRA. And the point is simple, Madam President. When anybody goes to apply for a driver's license or a state ID, as you're filling out those forms, you do add name, date of birth, your address, you're signing all that same information for a driver's license or an ID that you're putting on the voter registration card or form when you're registering to vote. And yes, you do sign as to the accuracy of the information under penalty of perjury. So it's not just, check the box nonchalantly. You're signing under penalty of perjury. And there have been cases when people are charged with false registration or improper registration. So the laws are working. The instances of ineligible voters voting are very, very rare, but they happen. That means our laws are working. So we'll keep trying to work on the Invite Act, but I encourage my colleagues to think about not just the spirit of this proposal, but the context of the success of the NVRA over the last several decades. Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, we need to remember a couple of things. First, when someone has gone through the process of immigrating to the United States, they've completed a journey, perhaps a lengthy odyssey of moving to the United States, applying for and ultimately obtaining U.S. citizenship. They've provided a lot of documentation. They've done a lot of things to make that happen, and it would be an insult to those who are U.S. citizens, whether natural-born or naturalized citizens, to make it easy for people to cheapen that, to undermine it, to dilute that by coming in and saying, I'm filling out my driver's license application, and all I have to do here is check a box. Check a box, sign my name saying, yeah, I'm a U.S. citizen. Well, that's not an option in other areas where citizenship is required. It's absolutely not an option, for example, in applying for a passport, which is one of the documents that can be provided and often is provided when someone completes the process of filling out an I-9 and thereby establishing their work eligibility as a U.S. citizen. One of the forms that they can provide to help establish that is a U.S. passport. But regardless of what combination of identification they use, they do have to establish their citizenship. Why? Well, because that is the law. There are very good reasons why we have those laws in place to make sure that when someone starts a job, they're either a U.S. citizen or they have a visa with some type of work authorization in it. So it makes zero sense that for something as significant and important to the very foundations of our constitutional republic as the right to vote, that we could just so lightly cast aside the need to verify citizenship. When we go out of our way in other contexts, like starting a new job, to make sure that they prove it. So sure, yeah, my friend and colleague points out, when people fill out that driver's license application, they do have to check that box and they do have to sign their name, but why make it so that someone could lie? Especially when read against the backdrop of the Supreme Court ruling 12 years ago, concluding, wrongly in my view, but concluding nonetheless, and that decision's on the books, that not only did they not have to prove citizenship, but no state official, when receiving the driver's license application form, may even inquire. Even if they have reasons to doubt, even if the person has admitted something, or otherwise, they can't ask. Even if there has been a wave in that state, or in that area, or across the country, of non-citizens registering to vote, and that state wants to make a decision, we really ought to provide some degree of documentation. They're not allowed to do any of that. So this is filling that gap, and it's important to do that. To that end, Madam President, notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 22, the SAVE Act, which is at the desk. I further ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from California.
Thank you, Madam President. I reserve the right to object, not for the first time on this proposed SAVE Act, not even for the second time on this proposed SAVE Act. This is an item that my colleague has brought up repeatedly here before the Senate. So I won't repeat the arguments and explanations that I've made in prior objections to the SAVE Act, but to suggest it is a solution in search of a problem. Audit after audit, review after review, investigation after investigation has demonstrated that the instances of ineligible immigrants voting in elections is exceedingly rare, which again means our current laws are working. And to suggest that birth certificates be required for certain tasks when it's already secure. I don't make it a habit of walking around with my birth certificate in my pocket. A passport's another acceptable form of documentation for citizenship. Half the American public doesn't have a current valid passport because not everybody travels abroad on a regular basis. So they're unnecessary. Our current laws are working, and therefore I object.
And is heard. The senator from Utah.
Madam President, with great respect to my friend and colleague, the distinguished senior senator from California, he suggested that the SAVE Act, which merely requires some type of proof of citizenship when someone registers to vote in U.S. elections, that the SAVE Act is itself a solution in search of a problem. My friend also suggests that no documentary proof of citizenship is or should be made necessary, even considering the Supreme Court's ruling that states are not even allowed to request such documentation where they may deem it necessary. He suggests that this is the case because, as he puts it, the occurrence of non-citizens voting in U.S. elections is not only rare, but it's exceedingly rare, as he puts it. I don't know exactly what that means, but I do know that, taken to its logical conclusion, that same logical leap could and would lead us to all kinds of outcomes that we would never dream of. There are all sorts of things that may be rare by some standard or another. Sure, it's true that most of the people voting in U.S. elections are not non-citizens. And in fact, I would say that they would be a small minority of those casting votes, because most people here in the United States, most people voting in U.S. elections are, in fact, U.S. citizens. But taken to its logical conclusion, that would suggest that there's no need for TSA, which I'd be fine with for all sorts of reasons. But taken to its logical conclusion, that would suggest there's no need for you to identify yourself when you go through TSA, because instances of terrorism are exceedingly rare, or instances of people boarding an airplane in somebody else's name are exceedingly rare. Sure, that happens. Taken to its logical conclusion, it would also suggest that because instances of people starting a job, beginning employment in the United States as an American citizen, or as a non-citizen pretending to be an American citizen, are exceedingly rare, as he puts it, and therefore we should require no documentary evidence of either U.S. citizenship on the one hand, or work eligibility with a visa on the other hand. I could go on and on, but it is not an answer to the need for the SAVE Act, to the demand that 80+% of the American people agree with, which is non-citizens shouldn't vote in U.S. elections. It's not an answer to that demand, to that widely held bipartisan supermajority view. Not an answer to that to suggest that because non-citizen voting is rare, we need not require any proof of citizenship, ever. Why? Well, there are so many reasons why, but here's the simplest one. When we make that easy, more people would do it. Some elections are decided by large margins. Others are decided by, to use his words, exceedingly small margins. We would be doing ourselves and the American people and the American Republic and the U.S. Constitution a grave, grave disservice, Madam President, if we didn't take that risk very seriously. Foreign election interference and meddling in our system is a real threat. We need to take it seriously. It's tragic and unfortunate. In fact, it's shameful that we haven't passed the SAVE Act. This is not the end of this issue. I'll be back. We'll get this passed. But between now and whenever we do get it passed, the American people are taking on a risk because of this body's unwillingness to act. And it's not this body, let's face it, it's members of this body on one side of the aisle and not on the other who are willing to incur this risk. That, tragically, is a sacrifice they're willing to make. We, tragically, are a sacrifice they're willing to make. Let's not let them continue to make it. Let's pass the SAVE Act. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator from Utah is recognized.
Mr. President, last year, this body, the United States Senate, passed 41 bills from the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. 25 of those bills have been reintroduced. All have bipartisan support. All have been vetted in committee. All are ready to move. Today, I'm asking that we pass 4 of them at the same time as a modest step forward for the kind of open, member-driven process for which the Senate was built and has long existed. The first, from Senator King of Maine, would expand access to the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, something that passed this body unanimously last year. The second, from Senator Cornyn of Texas, would adjust the boundaries of Big Bend National Park. Again, a common sense proposal with bipartisan support. The third, from Senator Gillibrand of New York, would establish a National Historic Park at Fort Ontario, the site of the only Holocaust refugee shelter in American history. And the fourth, from Senator Lankford of Oklahoma, would designate the historic Greenwood District, also known as Black Wall Street, as a national monument. The Greenwood District in Tulsa was once a thriving community of black-owned businesses, of professionals and families, until the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 tragically burned it to the ground. Hundreds killed, thousands left homeless. Designating this site as a national monument is long overdue. And this month, May 31st, in fact, just a few days from now, marks the anniversary of that tragic massacre. With that, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources be discharged and the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of the following bills en bloc. S-282, the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument access, from Senator King. S-1051, Historic Greenwood District, Black Wall Street National Monument, from Senator Lankford. S-432, Fort Ontario Holocaust Refugee Shelter National Historic Park Establishment Act, from Senator Gillibrand. And S-1112, Big Bend National Park Boundary Adjustment Act, from Senator Cornyn. Further, that the bills be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I would just say to my colleagues, I very much wish that I was not in this position. This morning, I was, like Chairman Lee, I was chairman of the committee, and I know that this is a challenging process to put these measures together. And Chairman Lee and I have worked very closely for years on these issues and a host of others, and I look forward to having plenty of opportunities in the future to continue our good work. So the reason I'm here is I requested that 2 additional strongly bipartisan measures that already cleared the chamber last Congress and had no objections be individually included in the request. One of those bills was S. 356, the Secure Rural Schools Reauthorization of 2025, that for years I have championed with my friend and colleague from Idaho, Senator Crapo. And across the West, this legislation has had bipartisan support because it would reauthorize a crucial lifeline, particularly for schools and law enforcement and roads throughout the West. I was in Grant County recently, small community in Eastern Oregon, and they're basically hanging by a thread if they don't get the Secure Rural Schools money restored. So that's why I'm here on the floor today. I'm clear that I want us to work together and to get this done as expeditiously as possible. I'm committed, as I have been over the years, working with Chairman Lee to advance these bipartisan proposals swiftly. I deeply regret being out here and having to express my concern today and to object. And I just hope that we can be back on this floor very, very quickly to pass this good package of bills and make sure that the Secure Rural Schools legislation is included. And for that reason, Mr. President, I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I appreciate the kind words of my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from Oregon. I know our time is short, but I need to respond to a couple of points. First, the bills to which my Democratic colleagues are referring have been cleared. They've been cleared through what's known as our hotline, cleared for passage on the Republican side. Not one objection from one Republican. It's the Democrats that are the holdup there. We are not the ones. Secondly, I want to make very clear that this is a very unfortunate occurrence in the Senate. It's a bad habit we've gotten into, and it's a habit that we must break. The habit involves raising an objection. One of the things you did not hear from my friend and colleague from Oregon is a single objection, not on the merits, not on any legitimate procedural ground, to any of the bills that I just mentioned, not a single one. No, these bills are drawing an objection today, not allowed to pass the Senate today, even though they've passed in the past unanimously. They don't have any substantive objection. They're objecting to these, not because they are unpopular, but because they are popular. When they are popular, when the need for them is due and undisputed, when there is no legitimate argument against them, when the House delegation, the local population, the Senate delegation is all supportive of them, they use them and take them as hostages. And they use them so that the way these things can happen is they'll cobble together a whole bunch of bills. These bills all accomplish similar things. They have a lot of commonalities. They do similar things. They enjoy similar amounts of support. They've passed in the past. Local communities overwhelmingly support them. It makes sense to offer these up together. We ought to do them individually as often as we can. But what they want to do is what's been done in the past is you cobble together a whole bunch of bills, sometimes a dozen or more, maybe dozens of them, and then time the introduction of that package to a moment just before a major holiday or a long scheduled recess. They bring them forward and they say, take them or leave them. You must take all of them or have none of them. And what that does to public land states like mine, where 67% of the land is owned by the U.S. government, we're beholden to everything, puts us in an impossible position. Usually these deals are put together by 2 or 3 people in secret, and they bring it forward at the last possible minute with no time for debate, no time for amendment, no time to say, okay, this one doesn't belong, the others are fine. Take it or leave it. It's extortion. We've got to end that process. There is not one legitimate reason why we shouldn't pass any one of these 4 bills. Let's get this done today. I find it tragic that this drew an objection.
Senator from Oregon.
Just to briefly respond, because we're hearing about hostages and extortion and all this kind of thing. I just want my colleague to know, because he and I have worked together for years and years, and we've never had a difference of opinion that was based on somebody trying to take hostages and these kinds of things. This is about something that is really, in my communities, a question of whether they're going to make it in terms of keeping the schools open. There are no objections to what Senator Crapo and I have been trying to do here. Let me repeat that. No objections, and throughout the West and the federal government, like my colleagues state, the federal government owns much of our land. People are waiting to see if we'll work together and fix this. And I want to tell my colleague, I'm happy to join him in 20 minutes if we have worked this out, and we'll be done. And as my colleague says, we'll go home and say we got something else done that was constructive. So I want to renew my point. This is not about politics. It's been bipartisan. There are no objections. And I stand willing with my staff to join the Lee staff right now. We work together over the next few minutes. We have a unanimous consent request, and we're done. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Utah.
I've got colleagues ready to speak, and I just need 10 seconds here. Look, I respect and appreciate my friend and colleague from Oregon, and it was not to him personally that my comments about taking bills hostage was drawn, but this is a process that has happened in the past over and over and over again. This is how it's playing out. As to these bills, I reiterate, there is not one Republican senator objecting to them. Bring them forward. Let's pass them now. There are problems. I don't know what they are or why they would arise. They're on the Democrat side, not ours. But that's not our problem. It shouldn't be an impediment for Senator Cornyn's bill or Senator Langford's bill or Senator Gillibrand's bill or for Senator King's bill that the Democrats can't get their act together, that for some reason they're not willing to support that legislation. This is unfortunate. We've got to fix it. Thank you.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, last year, this body unanimously passed 41 bills from the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Now, 16 of those bills, for one reason or another, it didn't end up getting signed into law last year. Some of those bills perhaps were casualties of the legislative calendar, or for one reason or another didn't make it through, but they remain undisputed. They remain non-controversial, and they've been reintroduced by Republican and Democratic senators and are clear on the Republican side of the aisle. It's important to note here that these non-controversial bipartisan bills all remain completely unchanged. Not a single letter, not a single period, comma, exclamation mark has been altered from them. They remain utterly uncontroversial, not a whiff of partisan dispute as between them. In the past, these bills were, in many circumstances, packaged together. It's been something of a custom in the Senate to package together groups of bills. Lands bills, in some cases, were paired together as part of much larger bills. And in some instances, parts of some of those bills were themselves controversial. Larger bills that were sometimes written in secret and not available to individual members to review prior to the time that they were propounded for a unanimous consent request on the floor. And so today, I'm going to make an entirely reasonable offer to move 4 bills off of the floor from among that group that passed last year by unanimous consent in the Senate. They are unchanged, they are still non-controversial, and they carry no substantive policy objections, no objections to the merits of the bill, what they do. They are bills that are locally supported, bills that have been thoroughly vetted by the Committee of Jurisdiction and that are ready to move today. In short, they're bills that are ready to move in the same type of open, member-driven process that the Senate was built for, and that the Senate, quite frankly, prides itself in fostering and encouraging, rather than being held hostage for a larger backroom deal negotiated in secret. The first is a bill from Senator Barrasso that would provide common sense flexibility for ranchers during natural disasters to help ensure rangeland health on federal lands. The second is a bill that I've introduced called the Utah Wildfire Research Institute Act, which would add Utah as a 4th location for the Southwest Ecological Research Institutes. which would be housed, for the Utah portion of it, at Utah State University. This institute would foster collaboration to promote healthy forests, wildfire prevention, and resilient water supplies. Utah is well positioned and ready to work with the other institutes, including the New Mexico Forest and Watershed Restoration Institute, to protect the unique landscapes and communities across the western United States. The third bill is one from Senator Cortez Masto, the Sloan Canyon Conservation and Lateral Pipeline Act. This bill would make certain boundary changes and would authorize a right-of-way for the Horizon Lateral Water Pipeline in Nevada, something important to Nevadans. As a desert state like mine, water for Nevadans is very important. The fourth bill is one from Senator Padilla, which would adjust the boundary of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Now again, just to reiterate, all four of these bills have certain things in common. They do different things, they operate in different parts of the country, they've got different sponsors from different political parties, but they all have a few features in common. They all passed by unanimous consent in this body just a few months ago. Not a single Republican, not a single Democrat objecting to any of them. And they remain entirely unchanged and entirely non-controversial. If there is any outstanding policy issue, I'd love to be aware of it and would love to address it. But as of this moment, I'm aware of not one. Not on the House side, not even on the Senate side. And so to that end, Mr. President, as if in legislative session and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources be discharged and the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of the following bills in block. S-211, Resiliency for Ranching and Natural Conservation Health Act from Senator Barrasso. S-457, the Utah Wildfire Research Institute Act of 25 from myself and from Senator Curtis. S-1142, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area from Senator Padilla. S-392, Sloan Canyon Conservation and Lateral Pipeline Act from Senator Cortez Masto. Further, that the bills be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, all en bloc.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, and I appreciate the senator from Utah being here tonight to offer this package, but I believe there needs to be a more bipartisan and thoughtful way to consider how we protect the future of our public lands. For example, that the legislation that the senior senator from Utah wants to pass tonight does not include my Wild Olympics bill. Now, this is a bill that will help to preserve the wild and scenic rivers of the Olympic Peninsula that has very strong support from Democrats and Republicans in my state. There is a strong nonpartisan coalition of support for this bill from tribes, hunters, fishermen, conservationists, and even loggers. And that is because my bill supports the peninsula economy and ensures that continued access to our world-class outdoor recreation on the Olympic Peninsula, and it conserves critical habitat for salmon and water resources for our very rural communities. Moreover, this bill has passed the House several times now with bipartisan support. In fact, Mr. President, I have been working on this for over a decade to build support and consensus around this bill. It is carefully drafted, it's a thoughtful piece of legislation, and the grassroots support for this bill has only grown over the years. That is exactly the kind of bill which should be included in a bipartisan public lands package. I would invite the senior senator of Utah to visit the land this bill covers to help protect our Olympic National Forest. I think you would find out why I am here tonight objecting to this, because it doesn't include it. I want the senator from Utah to know my door's always open. I hope that in the future we can work together in drafting a public lands bill that does include legislation like my Wild Olympics bill. And I know I'm not alone. Many of our colleagues have worked on important legislation for their respective states. So for now, I object, but I do so, Mr. President, with my hand outstretched, ready to work with the senator together on a public lands package that is comprehensive.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I appreciate the characteristically thoughtful and thorough remarks by my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from Washington. I do want to be clear about a couple of things. Number one, this has been the product of a lot of effort on our part, good faith efforts that we've made to work with Ranking Member Heinrich and members of both political parties to move these bills to the floor and to get them passed over many months. Now, again, I want to reiterate, if there are substantive policy concerns with any of the bills in this package, understanding that these are only 4 bills. Those 4 bills don't comment on, they neither preclude nor prejudice in any way, shape, or form our ability to pass other bills. Anytime you're choosing a finite group of legislative proposals to be considered for adoption by unanimous consent or through any other expedited process, you are necessarily excluding others that are not on that list. And so it becomes incumbent upon those involved in the effort to decide which ones belong. So let's talk a little bit about how we go about that, about how we went about that here. With these bills, these are 4 of the bills that, again, passed the Senate unanimously just a few months ago, that remain unchanged in this Congress, that didn't draw a single no vote, a single objection from any Republican or from any Democrat. In that respect, they all have things in common, even though they operate in different states, have different sponsors from different political parties, and do different things. The bill of which my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from the state of Washington, refers is quite the opposite of those things. Now, I'm sure she has put an enormous amount of effort into it, and I'm sure it's important to her, and I'm sure it's been carefully drafted because my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from the state of Washington, is thorough. But there are some things that that bill doesn't have in common with these. And in fact, if hearkening back to childhood, there's a song called "One of These Things Is Not Like the Other." If you were try to include that bill in a list with these bills, that would be the clear standout. Why? Number one, it has not passed the Senate. Number two, it was considered in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and it resulted in a strict party line vote. Democrats versus Republicans, shirts versus skins. There was not a single vote overlapping between the two parties. That doesn't mean that it's not a good bill. Doesn't mean it's not important to her or people in the state of Washington. But it does mean that it lacks the core characteristics held in common by each and every one of the bills that I've just offered by unanimous consent. Now, if that is going to be the standard, that anytime there is any package of bills, a package consisting of 2 paired sets, Republican and Democratic legislation brought forward together, in this case, bills that drew not a single no vote, not a single objection from members of either party, and remain unchanged since that last happened. If anytime we try to offer those bills, it's appropriate to object in the absence of any substantive on the merits objection or concern with the legislation, it's going to be very difficult for us to get this done. Now, none of this means that we couldn't find a way to pair that with something that would make sense, coupled with any changes that members of both parties might insist on in order to make them comfortable with moving it forward. But it does mean that it would be incongruous, illogical, counterproductive, and destructive to the effort to pair that bill with this bill. That's a wilderness bill. By definition, by its very nature, it designates large tracts of wilderness and wild and scenic rivers. That's not something that is inherently repugnant to either party, but it does so in a way that ended up drawing objections and no votes from literally every Republican on the committee. That suggests to me that before it's ready to be included in a unanimous consent request, it might need some additional work. I'm confident that we can get it there. Most types of legislation can get to the point where objections can be addressed through some combination of modifications to the legislation itself and the legislation that it might be paired with in order to help offset those objections. But nonetheless, I'll keep working to pass bipartisan bills that have unanimous support. I hope and expect and respectfully request that my colleagues across the aisle would take into account these dissimilarities. And if they want to add others that meet similar characteristics, let's have that conversation. If they want to get to the point where we can pass Senator Murray's bill, I'm sure there is a way that that could be considered, and we could possibly get there. But we can't assume that you can pair something that's that dissimilar, that is by its very nature, and according to the legislative record, it's the very definition of partisan, and not the kind of thing that one can expect. We would be crazy to assume that something that resulted in a party line committee vote last year would suddenly get to the floor and not draw a single Republican objection. I would also hope that next time, when we add pairings to the floor, Democrat and Republican bills, I would love to see those hotlined on the other side of the aisle in the same format in which they were hotlined in our side. My understanding is that they were not in this instance, and they should be. There should be an apples-to-apples comparison. If they're given the opportunity, I can't imagine that many, if any, of my Democratic colleagues would object to any of these bills in isolation. And if they wouldn't object to them in isolation based on their substantive policy merits, and if they were given that in a hotline request, I think this would have turned out differently. Look, I do think it's important that we should pass bills expeditiously and in the light of day. These bills have gone through public examination in the light of day, and they have been found not wanting for bipartisanship. They have been found richly blessed with bipartisanship through a proven, undisputed track record. So, look, I think it's a big mistake to hold non-controversial bills put forward by senators in good faith, to hold those hostage in order to perpetuate a broken and sometimes corrupting process from a bygone era, one in which bills were prevented from passing, not because they were controversial, but because they were popular, and being used as bait in order to bring about the passage of other bills that were controversial. That makes no sense. What makes the Senate work best are those moments when we can identify things as to which we do not disagree. This, Mr. President, is one of those things. This, Mr. President, is where we can do better, and do better we must. I'm not going away. I'll be back. I'll be back soon, hopefully successful next time, and we'll do what we have to do in order to move the legislative process. But I humbly implore my friends and colleagues on both sides of the aisle, let's not take these moments where we do agree for granted. And let's not assume that just because anytime, by definition, anytime you come up with a list of 4 bills offered at once, that necessarily excludes the thousands of others that may be submitted during the course of any particular Congress in that legislative chamber. You can't get everything all at once. Why not take the things that we know can pass and have passed in the past? Let's get that.
I commend my friend and colleague, the senator from Wisconsin, for his outstanding work on this bill, the Shutdown Fairness Act. Senator Johnson has seized on something very important here. We're surrounded by people in this very building and throughout the United States and across the globe, people who are faithfully, valiantly working for the United States government. Now, some of them are staffers in this very room, not being paid. Some of them are the police officers we greeted on our way in who are keeping the Capitol Hill complex safe. Some of them are soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, guardsmen all over the world who are serving the United States government at risk of life and limb to keep us safe. And there are countless others in different occupations who are not being paid. Why? Well, they're not being paid because our friends on the other side of the aisle are wanting to expand government yet again. They may think that this is the right message, that this is a winning message. This is not. It's not the right message. It's not a winning message, even for them, because it highlights something. It highlights the danger in putting too much trust, too many responsibilities, too many functions in the United States government. So much so that when a crisis like this emerges, and the Schumer shutdown now drags well into its second month, they see that what the American people have previously regarded as a service performed by their government to them is now being held over them to extort even more money out of them under threat of planes falling from the sky. And we're told by Democrat after Democrat on television interviews and elsewhere, well, it's okay. It's okay because this is leverage. This is our leverage. Well, what do they want to use that leverage for? They want to use it so as to paper over the failures, the abject failures of Obamacare, this law that has succeeded in doing exactly one thing: enriching large health insurance companies while making all Americans poorer. Premiums have skyrocketed, coverage has diminished, quality has completely tanked as a result. They know this, they understand this, they see premiums continuing to increase year after year after year. And so what do they want to do with it? Well, they want to spend a lot more money moving forward. Money at a time when the U.S. government is already $38 trillion in debt. Money to hide, to conceal what it is that Obamacare is doing to the American people. When in fact, what Obamacare has done is diminished the health care options that the American people have. It used to be that you could negotiate with a health insurance company and buy a health insurance policy. But Obamacare in many ways made what was once health insurance illegal. We need to make health insurance legal again. We need to allow a willing customer to pay a willing insurer for a health insurance policy, rather than an Obamacare health plan, which very often, through its Byzantine labyrinth of federal regulations, just adds to the cost and adds to the profits, the bottom line of these huge health care companies. So yeah, they want to take this to extort the American people in their position of vulnerability at a time when we're told planes may start falling from the sky, at a time when people's airplane tickets are being rendered valueless because a lot of these flights are not going to be able to be made, and all kinds of other problems are happening, while at the same time, our federal workforce is not being paid. These are not the right people to punish for the failures of Obamacare. Don't let them carry that burden. Don't make them do it. They didn't do this to the American people. Obamacare did. Let's fix Obamacare. Let's make it legal again to have health insurance, actual health insurance, not that sort of bastardized form of health insurance that emerged from Obamacare's endless regulations that result in diminished quality, lower coverage, and endlessly higher premiums. Mr. President, this shutdown has gone on long enough. This shutdown should come to an end, and it should come to an end by the very generous offer made by Republicans time and time and time again to continue at spending levels that until just months ago were the Democrats' own spending levels. That's not enough for them. We've got to end the madness and end the shutdown. At the very least, even if we're not to end the shutdown, we should pass Senator Johnson's bill. We should do that tonight. We should do it right now. Because regardless of what you think we ought to do with Obamacare or any other aspect of government, these workers who have now gone for some time without a paycheck, they should not be required to make this sacrifice, especially when you consider what it's for. Hiding the true cost of Obamacare. That is shameful. Again, I thank and I commend Senator Johnson and his team for putting together this legislation. I'm proud to support it. I wholeheartedly endorse it, and I plead with my colleagues to vote for it, and let's get these workers paid. They deserve nothing less. Thank you.